landscape model exists in dichotomy to the racetrack model. So I think as an educator, education was presented to me like a racetrack, that in August, September, whenever the start of your school year was, our students lined up on the starting line and the principal waved some checkered flag and the races were off. And I had 9 months and the students went through the track. Some students went into pit row as they needed some extra help. Otherwise, students were whizzing around the track and we were counting laps. And at the end of 9 months, we saw how far kids got and we gave them a grade for how far they got. The reality was that that's not what happens. That students don't all show up at the same time, all in F1 racing cars tuned to their best. Students show up late to school. Students show up without having had breakfast. Students show up with some parents that have 1,000 books at home and and students who get to go to museums all the time, and other students who don't have that privilege.
We end up with kids who reach the finish line really, really fast on the racetrack, right? And they basically have to wait for the rest of the class. I know that I used to use those kids being actually the right way to put it, to help me teach the students who struggled more, which is one way of using their time, but doesn't actually progress them in any significant way, right? And meanwhile, we also have kids who get stuck on the sides of the racetrack and who can't move forward, right? Or who to continue with the metaphor, they need the tire changed, whatever. Some kids will feel stuck from the very first day of school and through an entire year or an entire unit or project, but in many cases through their entire education. And they're keenly aware of how behind they are because that racetrack makes it very clear, right? Speaking with teachers, actually, a lot of them have said, not only is it true, but I'm realizing as we're talking about it, that I probably teach just to the middle because it's so hard to get to the extreme edges. Or in other cases, teachers have said, oh no, this conversation made me realize that I only teach to the edges, right? And that I ignore the kids in the middle, right? Because I need to make sure everybody's okay on those edges. Regardless, it doesn't really work.
Students show up differently. They show up more like they might on a landscape. Some students clumped together on the prairie, other students up on a hill, and some students maybe stuck in the bog or over the river over there. And as an educator, we more often find ourselves as shepherds on a landscape than a race director. I've never found myself in the easy job of a race car director. I've always found myself as a shepherd. And when we set up education or anything in a metaphor that's a false metaphor, we make more work for ourselves because that metaphor doesn't help us figure out how teaching and learning should happen. It actually causes more stress later on and more work for us. The landscape as a model might seem like more work because we allow students to be where they are on that landscape, and we allow students to find multiple pathways forward on that landscape to multiple points on a horizon. And to think about managing that seems unwieldy. It seems like it's more work. And it is more work than a racetrack model if the racetrack model was true. The problem is the racetrack model isn't true, and we end up trying to spend our time teaching to the middle of the bell curve and not having enough time for the kids who need this extra thing over here, or not being able to spend enough one-on-one time with the kid who just needs a little bit of our time to figure out that concept to be able to engage in what's happening. When we plan for learning on a landscape, we plan for reality. We plan for what's actually there. Teachers often ask, well, what does that mean? Am I going to plan a rocket ship unit for Capono and a dinosaur unit for John and a deep sea unit for somebody else? And that's not what we propose in the landscape. The landscape, the boundaries of the landscape that we're on should be defined from what an educator believes is important to learn and understand. We might be on a landscape of interdependence in a coral reef environment, for example. What we mean by allowing students to come and be themselves on that landscape, first of all, is understanding what students bring with them. That students aren't tabula rasa, they're not a blank slate. They bring their previous experiences, they bring their hunger or lack thereof, they bring their families, their religion, their cultures, their gender, everything that is them, they bring with them. And like a landscape, our classrooms are ecosystems. One student's, what they bring with them interacts with what another student brings with them, interacts with what teacher brings with them, and it is truly a living ecosystem. In that ecosystem, we can then find out what students are curious about, what powers them through that landscape. So the landscape model of learning isn't about creating individual units for individual students. It is very much doable in a traditional classroom. It's about understanding who students are coming to your classroom and what might interest them or spark their learning within that unit. If we spend the time to do that and allow students to be where they are, plan for them to be in different places, and then we leverage that spark of inquiry in them, which powers them through the landscape.